This is It's Gonna Be Okay with Dr. Roseann, and today we are continuing our conversation about pathological demand avoidance or PDA, and we're talking more specifically about how is PDA different from oppositional defiant disorder or ODD. Let's understand ODD a little bit better. So, oppositional defiant disorder is when you are reactive, right? You have big reactions to and resistance to any type of demand, right? And it happens for a lot of reasons. And when we talk about root causes, and ODD is actually a clinical disorder. Now, I got beef with it being a clinical disorder because and I'll explain it. It's real, but it is really part of other clinical conditions. When I see ODD, right, and your resistance, your non-compliance, right, extreme reactions to requests, right, and they're angry reactions, and it really is when you're asked to do pretty much anything, and particularly when they're viewed as an authority figure, right? Um, I don't see brain patterning of ODD. What I do see is that ODD is a behavior that occurs with ADD, depression, pandas. So for me, it's a subcondition. Even though it's in the DSM, I see it as a co-occurring condition and a behavior that can be addressed. So the root causes of ODD often are that there are clinical issues, trauma, we have neuroinflammation, chronic stress. There are multiple reasons why it occurs. And I definitely see it occur a lot more when there is an authoritarian type parent, not authoritative, but an extreme disciplinarian, right? So we know that the two extremes in parenting, authoritarian and really sort of lax parenting, that we tend to get the same result in kids that struggle with self-regulation. They tend to have higher risk of lifetime issues of substance abuse and crime and noncompliance and all these other things. So over parenting and under parenting produce the same thing. We want our kids to be good decision makers, and that comes from doing autonomy supportive parenting, positive parenting, which is authoritative parenting, again, not authoritarian parenting. We want our kids to experience things on their own, and then we support them in it. They learn, right? So let's talk about PDA and ODD, how they're different, how they're the same. And first, obviously, let's start with how they are the same. So, number one, they are both resistant to authority. We're going to get into how that's different. They both struggle with challenging behaviors. These are difficult behaviors to manage for us as parents because there's such a resistance with ODD and PDA. I mean, these are kids that you can't convince, right? They struggle with emotional dysregulation. The source is different, but they both struggle. They have social interaction issues in different ways, and they have very high levels of anxiety, right? So the moment things don't go their way, they can't control things, the anxiety runs high. So let's talk about how they're actually different. So they both struggle with motivation for different reasons. So with kids with PDA, they're struggling because they're anxious and they have a need to control. With kids with ODD, they struggle because of they have such a resistance to authority figures. That seems to be what's behind it. They both struggle with social understanding, but kids with ODD, obviously, they are not on the autism spectrum, or maybe they are if it's a co occurring condition, but they tend to have better social understanding. They still struggle in peer relations, but it's a different reason, right? So kids with PDA just miss some of the inferences, but kids with ODD struggle socially because they can be aggressive, verbally, physically, and they just are much more conflictual relationships. And that gets in the way of peer relations. Kids with PDA can be slightly more flexible than kids with ODD. They're not as rigid all the time as ODD kids. There actually being moments where they're more flexible. Kids with PDA do much more role play and fantasy play, as then I mentioned in our previous PDA video, they actually do a lot of it. You're not gonna see as much of that with kids with ODD, because a lot of the time they're stuck in a very irritated, angry mode. They both respond differently to structure, right? So kids with ODD get really angry when it comes in any kind of way that feels like it's authoritarian, right? And they can be resistant to structure because of their need to control. PDA kids can be variable in their response to structure depending on what it is. They're certainly not as angry about it. They may be anxious about it and they may be avoidant. And their response to interventions are different, right? So there are different interventions for both of these, kids. And certainly they both benefit from things that support calming and regulating their nervous system, but they are two different things, even though there's quite a bit of that overlap in that response to requests, right? But they're what's behind it is different, and they certainly act differently. So let's talk about navigating diagnosis and support. Obviously, PDA is not a diagnosed condition here in the United States. It never stopped me from diagnosing it or certainly helping leading people to resources about it. I do think it's a very valid subcondition of autism. And people need information that helps them to feel so validated because when you have a kid who's this resistant, whether it's PDA or ODD, you need clinical support. So you need to find a provider who's educated about both of these issues if you're struggling in either or both, and you need to get support for yourself, right? We got to calm that nervous system. We got to work on that, but you also need parenting support. These kids are incredibly challenging to parent, not that you can't find a way, but you're going to need professional guidance to help you navigate role play, deal with some of those common behaviors, and to foster and shape the behaviors that you want to see. This is what I see people being successful. So remember, we've got to calm that nervous system, come in with new learning, right? My trademark program is brain behavior reset for a reason. And we want to make sure that we're giving our kids what they need so that they can be more regulated and responsive to your parenting, and you need some support. So if you're looking for more support, you can go to www.drroseann.com/help. And, if you're looking to calm your own nervous system, grab some of our magnesium. You can go to drroseann.com/magnesium. It's there to help regulate the nervous system. And many of my really irritated and angry kids, regardless of their diagnosis, do incredibly well with, certain supplements, magnesium being particular, but also looking at what are some of those mutations and those variants that are affecting their nervous system. So I hope this was a helpful conversation. If you have a kid who's super resistant, defiant, exploring these clinical issues and getting a proper diagnosis, checking under the hood is always a good idea. And I do diagnostic assessments with people from all over the world so that you can get the right treatment right after you get the right diagnosis.